Welcome to the Dough Roller Money Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Berger. Today in episode 332, going to kind of bring you up to speed on my own investing, my own portfolio, what's going on in the world of my investments during COVID-19. I could just say, well, I haven't done anything. I haven't made any changes. Have a nice day. That's not quite true, but I haven't made any changes because of COVID-19. And the changes I've made have been I think in the grand scheme of things, relatively minor, but wanted to talk about them and show you my investments, show you my portfolio, not because I think my asset allocation is, the best or right for you. In fact, the longer I invest, the more I think the asset allocation, at least within certain parameters, doesn't much matter. You want to get the stock bond allocation right, but even with that, I think there's a lot of variance that would be perfectly acceptable depending on your specific circumstances. So that's what we're going to do today. And there's really kind of an historical note here because, I'm 53 and I'm kind of retired, kind of ish, as my kids would say. As you know, I sold Dough Roller a couple of years ago. And when I sold it, I definitely viewed myself as retired. And what I mean by retired, people kind of argue over what's retired now. Back in the day, you worked for 45 years and then retired meant you literally stopped doing any kind of work for income. And, you started taking your Social Security, whatever investment you had. You probably had a pension back in the day. And that was retirement. And then, things started to change. We got the computers and the internet, and it was easier to work later in life. We were living longer, all these changes. And then, of course, the FIRE movement kicked in, financial independence, retire early. And then there was sort of this debate over what it meant to be retired. There were a number of FIRE bloggers who were quote unquote retired. They'd quit their day job, the job that they got out of high school or college. But they were blogging. And frankly, they were making as much or even more from their blog. And so were they really retired? I don't know. The way I define retired is I'm getting most of my income from my investments. I'm drawing down my investments to live on. If I don't have to do that, whether it's because I've got a blog or a part-time job or some other forms of income, then at least for our discussion purposes, I wouldn't consider myself retired. So, all right, going back to 2 years ago, when I sold Dough Roller, I was absolutely retired. I had a few sources of income, so I wouldn't be drawing all of our living expenses from our investments, but goodness, probably 80% of them, I would say. Well, and then, it's just fate has it, I had opportunities come up. I ended up publishing my book, Retire Before Mom and Dad. It generates some income. I ended up working for Forbes. That generated some income. And lo and behold, I wasn't, it turns out, taking anything out of my investments. And so I didn't view myself as retired. I still felt pretty carefree, if you will. I worked from home. I had a very flexible schedule. I enjoyed it immensely, but certainly I don't think you would consider me retired in either a traditional sense or even in a more current sense. I wasn't, using my investments to pay our expenses. Well, that has slowly started to change. I'm still at Forbes, but very part-time. I probably still generate enough income from that and from the book and from a few other side things that I do that I don't yet consider myself retired. We're still living off of the income that these different side hustles, really, I guess you'd call them, generate. But I can see, I don't know if I'd call it the light at the end of the tunnel. I don't feel like I'm trying to escape from anything. But I can see in the next year or two potentially drawing more and more on our investments. And that's forced me to think about asset allocation a little differently because I could be spending the money that's in the accounts, not just investing it. So what I did 2 years ago when I thought I was going to be retired, and of course I now had my retirement portfolio, but I also had a fair amount in taxable accounts. So I had to kind of deal with that issue and how I did my asset allocation and where I put what investments, what in what accounts, what should go in taxable accounts, what should go in Roth, which we have very little of, what should go in tax deferred. But we were also planning to move, and I wasn't sure how much money we would be spending. So, long story short, I adjusted my asset allocation from 80-20, which had been my asset allocation for quite a long time, down to 70-30. And I thought 70-30, given that we were probably going to start living off of our investments, I thought that would be a good place to stay right now, at least until I figured out what, if anything, we were going to spend from possibly either renovating our old home or moving. All right. So that was the deal. And I figured once we got the home situation figured out, and I knew how much, if any, we were going to spend for that, I could then settle in on my sort of retirement asset allocation, which I figured certainly wouldn't be lower than 70% stocks. It could be as much as 75, but it also wasn't going to go to 80. So that was my thinking at the time. All right, well, we fast forward now almost 2.5 years. Hard to believe how much time. As you get older, time just goes by faster and faster. In any event, we moved. Didn't spend a significant amount of money to move. We didn't move into a McMansion or anything, but we moved, and it was a little more expensive than the home we sold, so we had to make up that difference. And we did a little bit to the house we moved into. Again, not like we added an addition or anything, just did some landscaping and things like that, but it cost some money. And that's all done now, or at least it's almost all done, and I know what we're going to spend. And so I was ready to sort of settle in on the Rob Berger portfolio until I'm 100 kind of situation. And as some of you know, if you listen to previous episodes, I had owned a couple of banks. Most of our investments are index funds, but I do own a few individual stocks, Apple, Berkshire Hathaway, and then I also own Citibank and US Bank. And the two banks were at a loss. When I bought them, I thought they were a great buy. COVID-19 hit and they tanked. Still think they're a good buy. I think banking financials generally are a pretty good investment now. That's my view. But I had a big unrealized loss that I could take if I wanted to. And I thought, I want to do that. I'm not wedded to Citibank and US Bank. So my plan was sell those two positions, take the loss that I can use down the road, and then just take the money and probably, rather than putting it into individual banks, I was going to put it into Vanguard's financial sector ETF. That was the plan. So I sold the stocks, and as part of that plan, I was also going to sort of rejigger my asset allocation, which I'll explain in a minute. And as I was working through it, something hit me that sort of should have been obvious, but I just hadn't focused on it. And that is the portion of my portfolio that was in individual stocks had really kind of gotten out of control. It was much higher than I was comfortable with. And that's true even after selling Citibank and US Bank. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is Tim Cook. He's just done too good of a job at Apple. And the result is my Apple stock has just kind of ballooned. I first bought Apple in 2013 for $56 a share. I'm going to pull up on my screen now for those watching via video. Let's see, Apple, and today is, what is today? Today's May 29th, 2020. Apple is trading at $318.65. I bought the first chunk of it for $56 in 2013. That would be a compound annual growth rate of about 28%. Not bad. Then I bought more in 2018, two tranches, one for 167, one for 169. And that was just a couple of years ago. I think the compound annual growth rate on that works out to like 38%. And it was a bigger chunk than the 2013 purchase. And then I bought it again in 2019 for like $142. Another sort of a fourth purchase. And it's more than doubled, of course, from the numbers that we're looking at here. And, it was just sort of crazy. I guess better lucky than good. I don't know. I always thought Apple was a good buy. And every now and again, the markets seem to freak out about Apple. They don't hit their numbers on their iPhone sales, or something happens and it just tanks. And it's happened, again, it happened in 2013, 2018, 2019. And I've just used those as opportunities to buy. That's the good news. It's done really well for me. The unsettling news is just that stock alone accounts for like 12% of my portfolio. You add in some Berkshire Hathaway and then either Citibank and US Bank or say a financial sector ETF, which is not an individual stock, but certainly a very focused investment. And I started to get nervous. It was too much for me. I don't want to sell my Apple stock and I don't want to sell my Berkshire Hathaway stock. So I decided against taking the Citibank and US Bank proceeds and putting it into the financial sector ETF. Again, still think that would be a good investment. I think over 10 years, I think it's a reasonable investment to make. So what I decided to do, and then the next question was, actually, before I get to my portfolio, the next question was, how do I account for these two now individual stocks that I own in my asset allocation? In the past, what I would do is just treat them as large cap US stocks and sort of bundle them with that group. The problem is, and again, it's all Tim Cook's fault, Apple has grown so much in my portfolio that it consumes too much of what would be the US large cap stock portion. And that made me uncomfortable. So I thought, here's what I'll do. I'll disregard Apple and Berkshire for a moment, the money that I have in that, put it aside, and just do an asset allocation plan with what's left. And if I do that and then add Apple and Berkshire back on, what would my stock to bond allocation be? Because remember, it was 70-30, and what would it take it to? Of course, it would go up. Turns out it would go to about 74% equities, 26% bonds and cash. And I thought that, I'm very comfortable with that. I'm comfortable with that for me for two reasons. One is I've done some substantial research on the 4% rule. In fact, I plan to write a book on it and actually do a series of YouTube videos. By the way, if you want to follow me on YouTube, just go to robberger.com/YouTube. I'm currently working on a series on how to use Morningstar, but I do other things as well. I'm going to do a series, like I said, on the 4% rule. Anyway, and I actually recently wrote an article for Vanguard that I think it either has been or will be published very soon on their blog. But one of the things about the 4% rule that folks don't always focus on is that William Bingen, who wrote the original article on it in 1994, assumed a certain stock bond allocation. His main assumption was 50-50, but he looked at other allocations. And what he concluded was that for his numbers to work out, and he looked at historical data going back to 1926, you need equities of 50 to 75%. Now, for folks in retirement, a lot of folks can say, boy, that's awfully rich. And I don't know that a lot of folks could stomach that. But, I felt like that really is the right allocation for me, somewhere in that range. So that was the first thing. I wanted to be somewhere in there. And for me, 50 is just way too low. I'm very comfortable at the high end. The second thing was I looked at my bond and cash allocation, which in this case would be, after you factor in the individual stocks, about 26%. And I asked, okay, how many years worth of expenses does that represent for my wife and I? And I looked at that number and it was quite significant. That's good enough for me. I'm very comfortable with that allocation given what I understand on the 4% rule and the historic market returns, but also how long my wife and I could live on our bonds and cash. And the number far exceeds any bear market our country has ever experienced, probably twice that. So that's sort of how I got to my allocation. Again, I share it with you. Maybe it helps inform what you want to do, but I'm not here to tell you it's right for everyone or for you for that matter. But I wanted to explain how I got to my allocation. So with that, let me show you my allocation. And again, what I did is I excluded the individual stocks I owned and applied these percentages to what was left. So for those watching on the video, you can see I'm allocating 30% to US stocks. It's really US large cap. And 10% to US small caps. 10% to REITs. Kind of scary to invest in a REIT right now with business basically shut down. But oftentimes that can be a good time to invest. In any event, I'm not market timing. This is just sort of my general approach. 10% to international stocks, and by that I specifically mean developed countries. 10% to emerging markets. Now, let me stop there for a moment. You know, that's 30, 40, 50% US, 20% international. You know, there are some that have argued you don't need any international. I think Warren Buffett would suggest that. I think John Bogle suggested that. One argument is if you're investing in large cap US stocks, they're doing business all over the world. I don't take issue with that. It's just that I prefer the diversity, particularly when I can diversify into other asset classes that have expected returns that are comparable to US stocks. Yes, international stocks have lagged US stocks the last whatever decade, but long term, I think the expected returns should be comparable, and it just helps me sleep better at night to have that extra diversity. So 10% developed countries, 10% emerging markets, and then for the 30%, I keep 2% in cash, and that gives us sort of what I would call our emergency fund that I'm comfortable with. And then the remainder I'm splitting between TIPS and intermediate term treasury bonds. And we've talked a bit about this, but the rationale is pretty straightforward. Investors in bonds make predictions about inflation, and those predictions get baked into the price they're willing to pay for a bond, which of course in turn sets the yield. With TIPS, you can almost think of TIPS as a bond with an insurance kicker. And the insurance is in case inflation turns out to be higher than we all expect, the insurance will pay off. And there's a cost for that insurance, and you see that in the difference in the yields between the two, between a bond and a comparable TIP. So the idea is if inflation turns out to be greater than we expect, my TIPS will pay off. If it turns out to be less than we expected, then the treasuries will pay off. And if it turns out to be exactly as we expected, then frankly, it doesn't really matter. So I'm kind of covering both bases. And that's actually a different approach than in the past. I just threw all my money in the Vanguard Total Bond Fund. And I think it's a perfectly a reasonable way to invest. I don't look back and think I made a mistake at all. And frankly, over the long term, it probably doesn't matter much. It's one of the things about asset allocation is learning what truly matters, but at the same time, you got to make a decision. And this just seemed comfortable and right to me. And so that's what I did. So that's my allocation. And then of course I add on to that the Apple stock and the Berkshire Hathaway stock. Now, what funds am I actually buying to implement this portfolio? And I'm going to show you all of them but one. The one I didn't include in here is one that I have to invest in because my 401k is at Fidelity. So it's a Fidelity index fund, but it's effectively no different than what you're looking at on the screen for those watching the video. And they're all Vanguard funds, no surprise there. For my small cap, it's just VSMAX. That's the Vanguard Small Cap Index Fund, the Admiral shares. In the past, I've gone with small cap value. Again, I think that would be a reasonable choice. I've become less convinced that betting on value versus growth is the most sensible way to go. I certainly think if I'm investing in individual stocks, I tend to prefer value. I bought Apple when it was value. I don't think it's value anymore. It's probably more of a blend, maybe even growth, I don't know. But in mutual funds, you know, you can look back at history and make an argument for value. And if that's what you do and that's the approach you take, it's the approach I took for years. I had small cap value. I think that's fine. I just felt there wasn't a need in my portfolio to make that wager, which is effectively what you'd be doing. So anyway, VSMAX for my small cap. For real estate, it's just the Vanguard REIT, VGSLX. Emerging markets, again, their emerging market index fund, VMAX, VEMAX. For Vanguard 500 index fund is just the VFIAX, that's their Admiral shares. You could go, by the way, with a total stock market fund. And in fact, I own some total stock market fund shares because they're in a taxable account with lots of gains and I'm not going to sell them. You know, in a perfect world, given that I'm allocating 10% to US small caps, I probably would stick with the 500 index fund. But if you look at these two funds over time, frankly, it's hard to really tell much of a difference. And then for internationals, I've got VTMGX. That's the Vanguard Developed Markets Index Fund. And then for the two bonds, TIPS are the VAIPX. And the Treasuries is just their intermediate term Treasury Index Fund, VSIGX. Now, one thing I'm going to be doing in the Morningstar series that I mentioned in the YouTube channel is actually putting this into Morningstar and then evaluating it using their X-ray tool and everything. I'm going to do that in videos in that series, so check that out if that's something that's of interest to you. But when I look at this portfolio, it's highly diversified by market cap, by region. I think the stock bond allocation is good. Again, this is 70-30. You add Apple and Berkshire and it becomes 74-26. And yeah, I'm very comfortable with this. It's basically the same allocation I had, although it was 80-20 at the time, before I got to this point where I'm like right on the doorstep of retiring. So frankly, I haven't, for all of the back and forth, I'm kind of where I started more or less. Again, the only real differences I'm looking at it would be small cap index rather than small cap value. And the way I'm investing in bonds is different rather than the total stock bond index fund. I've split it between treasuries and TIPS. Honestly, not significant differences. And there you go. So that's my allocation. Again, I'm not suggesting it's best for you, but wanted to share with you what I'm doing. The other thing I wanted to mention, and I've mentioned this in previous episodes, you know, I'm a big believer in the latte factor. And to kind of demonstrate that, I decided about a year and a half ago to start saving and investing all of my credit card rewards and cashback app rewards like Ebates or Rakuten, I guess they call it now. And that's true whether the cash back is in the form of cash or if it's points and miles. In fact, I just booked a ticket for my daughter using Chase Sapphire Reserve points. And then I took the value of that ticket and took it out of the checking account. Since I didn't have to pay it to American Airlines, I used points instead. And instead I paid it to myself and put it in my investment account. And I've been doing that for about a year and a half. And what I decided to do recently was take that money that I've accumulated so far and put it in M1 Finance, which is an online broker. And it allows me to invest in, scratch the individual stock itch that I still have. Now we're talking relatively small amounts of money as it relates to our overall portfolio. But I also wanted to give M1 Finance a try. So that's what I did. And let me just show you that for those watching on the video. Here it is. So first of all, my portfolio value. So $10,388.62. I'm very proud of that. That is just, that's no changes in our lifestyle. That's not working hard and denying ourselves and saving money. That's just not spending the cashback rewards from a credit card or the travel rewards. Instead, investing it. So that's where we're at right now. And in fact, as I think about it, we've got about $1,000 still worth of Chase Ultimate Reward points that once we use them for travel, because that's how they're the most valuable, we'll take that value out of our checking account. And again, rather than paying the hotel or the airline, we pay ourselves. And it'll go into this M1 account. I would say it's increasing by a couple $100 a month in terms of new contributions that we're making. Just depends on how much we've spent and how much that's generated in rewards. There are a number of cards that pay 2% cash back on everything, but I've found some that pay 3% or 2.5% to 3%. And I've talked about those in the past. Alliant Credit Union is one, 2.5% cash back on up to $10,000 in purchases a month. So, between that and Chase Sapphire Reserve, and we use Rakuten when we can, it adds up. And this is where it stands. I'll show you what I've invested in it. They call it pies. It's almost like, it's like Motif, if you remember Motif, since they've since shut down. But you can effectively, it's almost like creating your own mutual fund. You decide what stocks you want in your pie and what percentage will go in each. And then when you invest, they take the money and they can buy fractional shares and they divide it amongst those investments. And so I created what I call a financial pie. And of course, I can't have Citibank or US Bank in it because I created it less than 30 days from selling. I don't want to erase the losses that I locked in. with the wash sale rules. But that's fine. I ended up splitting our money between Wells Fargo, PNC Bank, and JP Morgan Chase. I think they're all very sound. Certainly the price of the stock is compared to either their earnings or their book value is, I think, quite attractive. Their yields are interesting. So if you look at JP Morgan, let's see if I can find their yield very quickly I know I could find it somehow. It's around 4%, I think. Why can't I find it? Well, I know I can go to Morningstar and find it. Come on, M1. Let's just go to research. I'll just look it up this way because I know it's here. Yeah, so their dividend yield is 3.5. Let's see, PNC, their yield is 3.8. And Wells Fargo is ridiculous. It's like 7 or something, 7.27%. Now, you may be saying, wait a minute, Rob, didn't you just record a podcast where you said dividends are bad? No, I didn't say that. I said that dividends by themselves don't make you richer. They just take your money from one account, put it into another, and then tax you if it's in a taxable account. And on top of that, you don't have any control over when the dividends are paid or how much. And 100% of that dividend amount is taxed, assuming it's in a taxable account. If I were to sell shares to generate money that I needed, only a portion of that would be taxed, right? Because only the gain portion would be taxed. So yeah, the love affair that I hear about dividends, particularly for retirees, I think is totally misplaced. But that doesn't mean as part of an overall portfolio, I don't want some dividends. And in fact, I tend to like companies that pay dividends because they're the kinds of value companies that I prefer when I'm investing in an individual stock. And I think it tells me that management is focused on investors. I'm not at all a fan of, say, a company, Google is an example, where they say, well, one, we're not even paying dividends, and two, we're going to have different class shares so that the original owners can maintain control. It's like, yeah, that's just not what I'm interested in. And some of you may say, well, Rob, have you seen the price of Google? It's done pretty well. Yeah, sure it has, and that's okay, and that's wonderful. And if you've invested in them, particularly from early on, you've done very well for yourself. I'm not here to take issue with that at all. It's just not the kind of companies I would invest in when I'm looking at individual stocks. So that's my M1, I guess, pie, they call it. I still can't get used to calling it a pie, but whatever. And yeah, all from credit card rewards. And I'm going to continue, by the way, I don't know if it'll be monthly or whatever, I'll probably do this in the YouTube channel, of updating you on how this is doing as a way to, again, continue to show the value of investing even relatively small amounts of money over time. So that's my update. That's what I'm doing with my portfolio. Again, no major changes, but some, I guess, but nothing major. And that's what I'm doing with M1 Finance. And that's what I've generated from credit card rewards. So that's the deal. That's the status. I hope you're hanging in there during still difficult times for everyone I know. Hopefully, maybe we're coming towards the end of, or not the end, but maybe I should say hopefully coming towards the beginning of a transition out of all of this craziness. I guess time will tell. But I hope you and your family are safe and healthy. By the way, feel free to shoot me emails. Now you can just send them to rob@robberger.com. That's the best way to reach me. As always, join the Dough Roller Facebook group, doughroller.net/Facebook group. That's continuing to thrive. And you can check out the YouTube page, my YouTube page. Just go to robberger.com/YouTube, and that will direct you there. And there you go. Hope you have a great day. And until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.